the nonprofit that brings these history camp discussions to you each week. We are excited to welcome with us tonight Arthur Herman. Arthur is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, and Gandhi and Churchill, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He joins us tonight to discuss his new book, The Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World. Thank you for joining us, Arthur.
Oh, delighted to be here. Glad we could make the connection.
Well, Arthur, most of the rest of the people watching won't realize that there was extensive planning that went into the specific timing of the announcement, the Nature magazine, and of course our appointment tonight. Instead, I guess it really was fortunately random. So the news about the dating of the artifacts to 1,000 years ago, the Vikings in North America. So really a fascinating discovery. Have you had a chance to read anything about that, or can you shed any light on it?
And I have, and I've been absolutely fascinated by the science brought to bear in order to make this kind of verification of what. Well, I mean, basically, scholars and archaeologists had known about that there were some Norse presence in North America, specifically in Newfoundland, and specifically in a small cove known as Anse au Meadow, which means Meadow Cove. It almost sounds like a coastal line from California. But anyway, in the 1960s, they found some remnants of a temporary, what looked like a temporary settlement, sort of a boat landing, and the artifacts clearly indicated that these were of Norse origin, almost certainly confirming the evidence that we had from Norse sagas, which had made the hero of this, Viking arrival in North America, Leif Erikson, right, son of Eric the Red, who was the Viking who had established a settlement on Greenland. And I think most people understood it was probably a matter of time before intrepid mariners like Vikings were going to venture further west and make landfall at some point. But still, the evidence was there was a settlement. We had no idea when it was, and we had no idea about really how long anyone had actually been there. What this most recent archaeological evidence does is to confirm the fact of their arrival there about 1,000, perhaps 1020, the Christian era. You say, well, how could they be so precise? Well, the reason is because what they did was to use tree ring analysis. Now, tree ring analysis has been used by climatologists and by archaeologists for years, because you know that in warmer years, trees grow more than they do in colder ones. So by counting the rings and the width of the rings, you can get an idea about how cold it is, year by year, even decade by decade. Well, people who study these tree rings had known for a long time that there had been a series of solar flares that had caused an increase in carbon-14 readings of the relevant tree rings. Are you with me so far? Right?
Yeah.
Now those solar flare caused carbon-14 readings came about 993, and this was all confirmed, by the way, by documentary evidence, because this is a global phenomenon. It wasn't just something in Newfoundland or North America; it was global. Well, what they found is that some chunks, some shards that had been left behind by these Viking construction engineers were wood that showed those same tree ring characteristics. And that the fact was that these shards had been cut with iron implements, which meant could only have been from Europeans, which could mean it could only be from those Vikings who had already left a trace there for archaeologists to find. What's interesting about this is not just the fact that we can date this now so precisely as to when there was a Viking settlement in North America, and that they were living there and working there and engaged in making lives for themselves, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus grabs the title as the first European to arrive in North America. But it also confirms the evidence we have from the Norse sagas, the saga of the Vinlanders, the saga of Eric the Red, which was that Leif Erikson was there, and the date was around 1000, dating from Leif Erikson's life and biography and from the other evidence that the sagas provide. So what it really means is, to wind up what makes this so fascinating and such groundbreaking news, is it really shows that the Viking sagas weren't just fiction. These weren't just sort of made up tales by poets gathered around the fireside. This reflects almost certainly real events, and that the chronology that the sagas propose is pretty much confirmed now by the archaeological evidence that this group of researchers has recently uncovered. It's an incredible story.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. I want to go back, provide some context perhaps for your interest in this topic and your research. People may know you best for your bestseller, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And here we are now talking about the Vikings. Do you want to talk to us about how the interest and any insight from the Scots, then later the Vikings, kind of are, to what extent those topics are related, and talk to us about what is the Viking Heart?
Well, I'll tell you, this book was, and you mentioned How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And when that came out, it was a New York Times bestseller. It was a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, as a matter of fact. My Uncle Norman. Now, my Uncle Norm's parents both came over from Norway just before World War I. My grandparents on my mother's side were, born and bred Norwegians and American immigrants. On my father's side, his great-grandfather came from Norway to America with an earlier wave of Scandinavian immigrants in the 1850s, just in time, by the way, as I talk about it in the book. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it tonight. Just in time to serve in the Wisconsin Regiment during the Civil War. But anyway, so my Uncle Norman, right, says, well, that's great. You've got a New York Times bestseller. So when are you going to write a book about the Vikings? And I didn't really have an answer for this, because I was already thinking about my next book, which was going to be about the British Navy. I spent a lot of time working in medieval history as an undergraduate and a graduate student. But my interests as a historian, as a scholar, had kind of moved into the more modern period. And I had in mind a slate of books that would talk about modern history, not go back to the age of the Vikings. So didn't have a good answer for Uncle Norman. So then I did a book called Gandhi and Churchill, a dual biography of Mohandas Gandhi and Winston Churchill. And that book was one of the 3 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, right? Very nice honor. So my Uncle Norman says, well, that's just great. You're a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So when's we going to see the book on the Vikings? Now, at this point, I wasn't going to be able to put Uncle Norman off any longer. And it was, however, it took almost another 8 years before I began to realize that the story of the Vikings really wasn't just a story restricted to to the Dark Ages or to the early medieval period. That really the story that makes us so fascinated about the Vikings is one that extends all the way through Scandinavian history, the extraordinary history of that unique region and the unique peoples who have lived there for centuries, but that it also was tied in with our history in America because of the role that Scandinavian American immigrants had come to play in the shaping of our country, in the shaping of our history. And it wasn't until I was able to make the connection between the age of the Vikings, and modern history and modern American history, that I was really prepared to write this book. And you ask about the title, The Viking Heart, and that's what really ties these two very distinct worlds together in the end, is the common set of cultural characteristics, what I would call the cultural skill set that makes up the Viking heart. A set of characteristics which take shape under the Vikings, but then they leave as their legacy to their descendants, first in Scandinavia, but then also is carried over and brought over by Scandinavian American immigrants in the 19th century. And that skill set really is one that arises from the incredible, inhospitable surroundings in which the Scandinavian tribes find themselves for over 1,000 years, enduring those terrible winters, and of course all without central heat, without any kind of modern heating capabilities here. And the way in which it bonds the community together, draws them together as one to work together to survive as a group, because you only survive by working and cooperating with others in this kind of environment, becomes an important ingredient in the Viking heart. But also, and here is the other key ingredient I want to mention, is that it also involves a recognition that from time to time, the individuals have to be willing to go in their own way, to take their own path forward, to find things that the group isn't aware of or not connected with, but they can set off to take the risk to bring back the goods, the knowledge, the confidence that the group needs in order to survive and prosper and to push on to the next advance. And by golly, that's exactly, as I explained in the book, that's exactly what happened every spring. Is that hordes of Danish and Norwegian and Swedish young men, and as we now know also from the DNA evidence, young women, set out from the fjords of Scandinavia to go out and find what they could find to bring back for the group's survival.
Fascinating. Well, I think many people have a sense, perhaps based on myth or popular culture, who the Vikings were. Why don't we start right there? Who were the Vikings? And let's also talk about the role of women in Viking culture.
Sure. Well, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about that image that we get of the Vikings from television shows, of being these sort of super warriors and being, sort of savages, right? I mean, what was that comic strip that ran for years? Hagar the Horrible, right? And it was sort of this hirsute, rather sort of gross character who lives on plundering on others. Well, this is a gross misrepresentation of what the Viking Age was really all about and who the Vikings really were. Now, it's perfectly true that they were intrepid warriors. It's perfectly true that when they set out on every spring, as I just described, and landed on the coast of Northern Europe or in the British Isles or pushed further west, that more likely than not, they were going to take what they could find and carry it away from those who were not strong enough or able to defend their possessions, right? If possession is 9/10 of the law, then when the Vikings land, they've got about 9/10. They'll take it from you. So in that sense, the Vikings really were the kind of dangerous marauders that history books and myth represents. But we have to understand that those Viking raiders, this was only part of what their lives were about. What their lives were really about was working as farmers, as fishermen, as livestock raisers and husbandmen and husbandwomen, keeping their families and their communities alive through those incredible winters. and eking a living out of a land with very meager resources, except what resources could be brought from the sea. And if that included fish, of course, and marine animals, that was one thing. But if it also meant the possibility of bringing back the goods and commodities that you could steal or trade from your neighbors, then that was also part of the bounty of the sea. And for the Vikings, the technologies that they brought to bear, first the great long ships with their broad beam, which gave them enormous buoyancy, but also shallow draft, which meant they could travel not only sea courses, but also river courses when necessary. And then the square sail that gave them incredible mobility and speed in action, whether it was, again, on a trading venture or on a marauding venture. That technology, plus the Vikings' need and desire to go out and to find what they needed, wherever they could find it, that was a potent combination, and it's one that intimidated Europe for over 200 years.
And why don't we go to then what you referenced a little bit ago, the evidence indicating the presence of women in some of these parties and so forth, and what we know about the role of women in Viking culture.
Sure. Well, again, I have to say, the Norse sagas, which are written down about 200 years after the heyday of the Viking age, that the Norse sagas have plenty of stories about, of these tough, resolute young women who, go into battle side by side with their menfolk, and who are in many cases, really quite powerful, charismatic figures. The name, in fact, they become known in the sagas as the Shield Maidens. The Shield Maidens, because of their warrior-like prowess on the one hand, but also their single status makes them, shall we say, desirable mates for those men who are intrepid enough and strong enough to take them on. But again, this is the Norse sagas, again, easy to dismiss as romantic fictionalizing of the role of women in Viking society. But now the accumulation of archaeological evidence, and the evidence that we get, by the way, from non-Viking sources of foreigners who encountered the Vikings, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, doesn't make any difference. They were all struck by the fact that women tended to have a far more equal role in what we would describe as being an equal role in society, and that although they had no political rights as such, they didn't participate directly in the tribal assemblies, the thing, which was the way in which Scandinavian tribes ruled themselves, elected their leaders, tried criminal cases, and so on. But they had limited rights of property. They had the right of divorce, totally baffling and shocking to Europeans, especially those coming from Mediterranean societies at the time. And we also know that they were often participants, not just in the voyages, like the voyage to North America, because the Viking sagas describe very well participations, including Leif Erikson's sister, as part of those ventures, but that they also engaged in battle. And in fact, one of the most interesting and fascinating grave sites that has been re-explored with using DNA analysis is one of a Viking leader in Birka in Sweden, which is a major Viking base. And the evidence now is that intrepid leader who was buried there and surrounded by, the honors of office and the respect and devotion of the entire community was a woman. That clearly you have a woman who plays this kind of role, and there was almost certainly she wasn't alone. That there must have been other women who played this kind of role and who continue again as part of the Viking heart. Part of that is the fact that the individual having the freedom to pursue their own path, to take their own path for the sake of the community, to work for the community. Well, guess what? It includes women as well as men. And that too becomes a defining characteristic of Scandinavian society in the post-Viking era.
Well, why don't we talk for a minute about the impact of the Vikings on Europe and their role in lifting Europe out of the Dark Ages, and then we'll go to their impact on North America, especially America.
Sure. Well, their impact on Europe at first was pretty frightening because the shock and awe tactics that their longship technology allows them to engage in, land, appearing out of nowhere from the sea, striking fast, and then disappearing again off to beyond the horizon before, the local community is able to garner enough troops and equipment in order to try and fight them off. They're gone already. They've taken everything that they want and have fled. Well, over time, as communities began to learn how to defend themselves, and the Vikings discover it's not quite so easy to take exactly what you want, that it may be more sensible and more reasonable to instead to trade for what you want. That there were an enormous number of commodities coming out of the north. For example, furs. For example, walrus tusks and ivories, amber. Enormous trade in amber, all up and down the Baltic coast in Northern Europe as well, in exchange for the manufactured goods and the other products that were very important for the Scandinavian society. Now, as I explain in the book, and explain in the Viking Heart, one of the important commodities that was part of the trade in Dark Age Europe was slavery. Slaves, not of course African slaves, but rather slaves taken from Slavic tribes and from the British Isles. And this was a world in which no community doing any kind of large-scale manual labor could imagine itself functioning without slaves. So there was nothing surprising or shocking about this element of trade. But the important thing to bear in mind here is that the Viking trade routes that were established, which included slaves, but also a range of other kinds of commodities here, become the key trading links for Northern Europe in the Middle Ages and on into the Renaissance. They are, as I explain and describe them in the book, the Vikings are in many ways really the precursors of globalization. When you've got Swedish Vikings penetrating all the way down through from the Baltic Sea, down through the rivers of Russia, the Don, the Dnieper, the Dniester, down to the Black Sea, and then to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman world. And when you have Danish and Norwegian Vikings landing and engage in expeditions all the way across Northern Europe through the Mediterranean, all around the British Isles, and then pushing further west to the Faroe Islands, and then to Iceland, and then to Greenland, you begin to sort of see a global trading network established by these incredible sailors and warriors and traders that the medieval world does not really relinquish, even after the Vikings' heyday passes, and they cease to be the kind of the terror or the intimidators of Northern Europe, but become more like the rest of mainstream European culture. Those trading links, those trading routes survive and will be taken over by others and become the way in which Northern and Western Europe are going to build their future prosperity in the centuries to come.
We started out tonight talking about this, again, the confirmation of the arrival some 1,000 years ago. Take us forward then to the some permanent settlements in North America and ultimately the Scandinavian impact, and maybe this takes us to some of your ancestors, but Scandinavian impact on America.
Right. Well, the impact, we have to say, we're separated by almost 1,000 years, aren't we? Because on the one hand, the landings that we're just talking about in the breaking story that over the last couple of days, of course, takes place around 1000 in the Christian era, and it's a very different group of settlers and explorers that we're talking about from the time. Namely, these are real Vikings, right? And as I mentioned earlier, too, it was only a matter of time that, having sailed west from Iceland to Greenland, that you would expect that mariners from Greenland and from the several thousand people we know settling in Greenland, that eventually they were going to make their way further west to see what else was there and to see what other kinds of trading opportunities presented themselves. And so it's not a surprise then that these landings did take place, the ones described in the Viking sagas and now confirmed by archaeological evidence. What we don't know is really how large or how long those settlements lasted. This latest archaeological evidence suggests they were probably more than just simply sleepovers. That the boat repair yard that was set up there, and the trading post that we know existed there, and the dormitories for the inhabitants and those who were attending to the settlement at Lens au Meadow, that we know that was probably, they were there for several years. That there was the makings of a more or less fixed settlement over a period of time. Then it came to an end. We don't know why. The sagas suggest that relations with the indigenous Native American peoples there deteriorated, and maybe the Native Americans just got tired of having them around and figured we're no longer doing the kind of business we were doing before, and it's time to chase them away. We outnumber them anyway. And maybe that was the reason why the settlements came to an end. Another explanation, which I talk about in the book, is that the decline of interest in trade in that part of North America, which is described in the sagas as Vinland, because we know there was vine growing for grapes and possibly for wine all along that coast. The climatological conditions were right for that. But that the interest in trade there and in the settlement probably declined as the Norse settlement in Greenland declined. Almost certainly, and I talk about this in the book. So this is part of how we can understand the patterns of trade across the Atlantic, right? That links North America to the sister colonies, Greenland and Iceland, and then back to Norway. What we do know is that Greenland and Iceland were almost bereft of any kind of trees. It's not landscapes that support large forests by any means. And if you're building settlements, building houses, boatyards, ships, you need lumber. And the North American coast, especially around Labrador and Newfoundland, provided lots of that. So it's very likely that these Norse settlements in North America and Newfoundland were part of a link connecting, if you like, lumber yards, cutting down forest, moving and so on, carrying timber back to Greenland and Iceland for use there. Now, as Greenland's settlement began to decline, as trade with the sister colony of Iceland and then Norway was on the wane, then there was less and less reason to maintain the voyages and the connections with North America. People packed up, closed up, whoever it was, the last one out, turn off the light, blow out the candle, and that's the end of it. It's not at all unusual in the medieval world for such a thing to happen. So I think a lot of the answers still about what happened with the North American Viking colony are linked to what happened in Greenland. That's my hunch. And the more we can find out about what did happen to the Norse settlement there, the more we'll understand why they came to an end further west along the North American coast. Now, of course, then 1,000 years later, well, almost 1,000 years later, you're going to get a new influx of Norse population into across the Atlantic into North America. But they're coming for, well, they're coming for very similar reasons, to be honest. They're also coming to find land. They're also come to make new lives for themselves in a land that offers more resources than their homeland does in Scandinavia. But they're also drawn by something else, and that is they're drawn by the promise, the land of liberty that America has become in the 19th century. This is very interesting, that if we look at the pattern of immigration, of Scandinavian immigration, it is very different from that of its precursors, including the Scots, who I wrote about 20 years ago, and their immigration to America. They went, again, for economic reasons. They went often for religious reasons. But, they went at a time when it was part of the British Empire. They went at a time, before the American Revolution and then afterwards. But the Scandinavians are drawn to America precisely because it is a free republic, precisely because it has established a legacy of freedom, of being able to live a life and make a new life for yourself as you, not others, see fit. And this fits in very well with the thousands, tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Denmark and Sweden and Norway and Finland, who find that the meager resources of their own societies represent an economic and social dead end, that for the poorest, there's no future there any longer. And America beckons as a place where you can have, big farms, right, on flat land. It's fantastic. What a great thing. Land that's actually flat, for 100 acres in all directions. This is unimaginable dream for your typical Norwegian or Swedish settler, but which also has a political system in which the rules of hierarchy, of nobility, of control by a state church no longer apply. And that combination of economic freedom and political freedom, I think, is precisely what made America, and not Canada, not Latin America, such a draw for settlers and immigrants making the voyage across the Atlantic to come to our shores.
Well, we touched on earlier the timing here of relatives, it sounded like, and their arrival and their opportunity to serve in Wisconsin regiments in the Civil War. Should we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess we should, shouldn't we? And here I'm going to have to get a little personal, because when I talk about this in the Scandinavians who do arrive, starting in the 1850s, which is when you see the big influx of Norwegians in particular coming to the American shores. There were terrible economic conditions in Norway in the 1840s and 1850s. We think about the great potato blight in Ireland. Well, it also affected Norway, and it was a choice for many of Norway's poorest: flee or starve. And they chose to flee, and the place they came to was America. And that included my great-great-grandfather, Ivar Jakobsson Sorley. And he arrived in the 1850s, found land for himself, and set up a farm in Minnesota, in Freeborn County. And it was there that he encountered a charismatic young man, also Norwegian, by the name of Hans Christian Heg, who was in the process of raising volunteers for a regiment to go fight for the Union in the war between the states, to defeat the secessionist southern states, and at the same time to establish freedom, not slavery, as the future of America and of their new American homeland. And so my great-great-grandfather signed up, as thousands of others did. It was an enormous influx of volunteers from Minnesota, from Wisconsin, from the neighboring states. All of them volunteers in a regiment known as the 15th Wisconsin. It became known, by the way, the 15th Wisconsin Volunteers became known as the Scandinavian Regiment, because there were so many Norwegians and Swedes and Danes who ended up on the muster rolls. In fact, there were so many Norwegians in the regiment that regimental commands were all given in Norwegian. We don't know what the Swedes thought about this. That's not recorded, but they seem to have adjusted. They seem to have adjusted to the reality of a chain of command being conducted in Norwegian. But it's an extraordinary thing, I must tell you. When I was going through the regimental roll for the 15th Wisconsin, looking for my great-great-grandfather's name. Oh, there it is, Ivar Jakobsen. And then just seeing the proliferation of names, the Knut Iverson, Ivar Knudsen. There were no less than 11 Ole Olsons in the 15th Wisconsin. As a matter of fact, it was an extraordinary thing. But these young men were battle tested, and it was in fact at the Battle of Stones River in 1862 that my great-great-grandfather was severely wounded in the leg, nearly lost his leg, but had to be invalided out of the service. I still have the mini ball that was extracted from his knee. As a matter of fact, it's a family heirloom passed on to me. And I got to tell you, it was an extraordinary experience writing that chapter about the Battle of Stones River and the Scandinavian volunteers, not just Norwegians, but also Swedes and Danes in the Civil War, while looking at that mini ball sitting on my desk. That's an unusual experience. That's all I'm going to say about it. But again, one of the things that I point out in that chapter, I should add here too, was just how many of the Scandinavian volunteers fought on the Union side. That it was very important for them that the Union stood for not just for the unity and the union of their new adopted country, but also that it took a stand against slavery and against the extension, and then ultimately for a stand for the abolition of slavery. It was a big drawing card for the Scandinavian volunteers, including, I no doubt, my great-great-grandfather. Certainly was for his commanding officer, Hans Christian Haig. And it's why you see even Scandinavians from southern states, in many cases, like Texas and like South Carolina, who chose to fight on the Union side and not for their own states.
Fascinating. I imagine those orders in Norwegian were probably pretty hard for the other side to make out. It'd be our own.
That's true. It would have been a bit challenging, especially since there were so few Scandinavians and scattered among their opponents in Tennessee and Georgia regiments. Probably.
Sure,
but of course, the other extraordinary thing about it too is that in many cases the Norwegians couldn't understand each other because of the different dialects. Do you see? These are still in the 19th century. Sweden, Norway, even Denmark were still societies very much built around local ties. We almost use the term tribal ties, the particular small community ties. And so a proliferation of dialects as opposed to a single national language was pretty much the rule, especially among Norwegians. And so establishing a single Norwegian language for the purposes of command can't have been an easy thing to do, even among the Norwegian volunteers. We know this from documentary evidence that was the case.
Sure. Well, this has been fascinating. I think Carrie's going to join us, and she has some questions from people who've been watching.
All right. So In Denmark, something happened that sort of triggered a renewed interest in Viking history. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it was the result of a robbery, as a matter of fact, of the Royal Heritage Museum in Copenhagen, when two golden drinking vessels were stolen. This is in the early 19th century, right? This is like 1810, 1811. The exact date's in my book. I'm not going to look for it right now. And these two golden drinking vessels were suddenly stolen from the museum. And eventually, the investigation traced them back to a goldsmith who had engaged in various kinds of nefarious practices before. But everyone was horrified to learn that these Viking drinking vessels had been melted down. The guy melted these things down in order to get the gold, to recoin it as as gold coins for his own purposes here. And it set off a national reaction. And suddenly people realized that these artifacts, which they had more or less taken for granted, no one paid much attention to them. That's one reason why you could steal them, right? They were sort of, in the back room at the museum. That these represented an imperishable legacy that had been left to Danes by their past, and particularly by their Viking past. And that at a time when the Danes were in a kind of, what shall I say, in a state of kind of crisis, a psychological crisis, their steady decline as European powers, of watching the other great powers of Europe, France and Germany and Russia, more in England, more or less paying, less and less attention to what the Danes wanted, that they really carried no weight anymore in European affairs. And so there was a sense of a kind of, not just a sort of a, what should I say, an archaeological, historical loss, but a sense of national loss. And it triggered a sudden fascination with all things Viking. It started first in Denmark, then spread to Sweden, and then as the century wore on, the Norwegians get into the act too, and they begin to realize that having lived for centuries under the rule first of the Danes and then of the Swedes, the Norwegians had a glorious history too during the Viking era and Viking age. Leif Erikson, for crying out loud, and the discovery of North America. That there was a whole history, a whole legacy that had not really been explored or really understood until now. And so you see this, well, I'm going to call it Viking mania, that seizes upon all three Scandinavian countries, beginning in the early 19th century, and it lasts all the way down to the end of the century, as a matter of fact. And with it comes some really sort of serious archaeological work, as well as more sort of speculative, romantic stuff. And a fascination with the Norse sagas, and realizing that these are valuable and important pieces of European literature that need to be understood and to be analyzed, and that they provide a tremendous national resource about Norse mythology and about the Norse gods, that far from reflecting a backward savage peoples, which is the way the 18th century has thought about Vikings for a long time, in the Age of Enlightenment, after all. That in fact, that the Vikings were more than just simply, savage warriors, that they really were a great people with a great literature, with great accomplishments, and that it was a past to be celebrated and to be embraced by their modern forebears, their modern descendants, and by those who would come to recognize their enormous literary as well as historical gifts. And so Viking mania, it's an important part of the story because it brings the Norse sagas into the mainstream of European literature and Western literature really for the first time, and has an enormous influence. First in the operas of Wagner, The Ring of the Nibelungen. It's all based on Norse saga stories and myth. And then in the 20th century, it gets passed on to another big fan of Norse literature, and that's J.R.R. Tolkien. And you cannot talk about the Lord of the Rings trilogy and its influence on popular culture unless you understand how deep its roots lie really in Norse mythology and Norse sagas, and in that whole Viking legacy that goes with it. I talk about it again. I explain it further in the book, and I recommend to anyone who wants to sort of see the links between our own modern popular culture, from Lord of the Rings to Star Wars to Harry Potter to the world of the Vikings and the Norse sagas, kind of lay it out for you in the book, and I recommend it for anyone who really wants to explore that more.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been fantastic. And we have a link to Arthur's book in the chat, and there's really so much information packed in there. Lots of good stuff for you to check out. So we recommend taking a look at that and checking out that book. We also have put a link to the article about the new discovery today. So that is in there for you to look at as well. And if you enjoyed this, we hope that you will join us again. Tell your friends about it. Sign up on our email list if you have not already done so, and share our social posts and our emails with those who might be interested as well. And please consider making a small donation to the Pursuit of History. That's the nonprofit that brings these to you every week. Next week, we will be speaking with Michael Burlingame. He is one of the country's foremost experts on Abraham Lincoln. And we will be talking about Lincoln's relationships with African Americans. It's going to be a great discussion and one you don't want to miss. So we will see you next week. Thank you, Arthur, for your time with us tonight. And thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.